So I want to thank everyone for joining us today for our discussion. My name is Christina Bain, and I am the Director of the Initiative on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery at Babson College in the United States. And we're very excited to begin our 2018 webinar series, the Human Trafficking, Organized Crime Nexus, Intersections, Vulnerabilities, and Analysis for the private sector. This webinar series is part of the RESPECT initiative, which you're going to be hearing more about today from Tuesday Ratana, our esteemed moderator. And we're thrilled to, again, be continuing on with our series. This is now our fourth webinar series that we've done through this growing initiative, and we're so excited that all of you could join us today. Just a few technical points as we get started. I want to let everyone know that we are recording this webinar. We will be sharing it with you as soon as we have finished compiling the recording. So you'll be receiving not only the audio, but all of the different PowerPoint presentations and any of the visuals that you'll see on your screen here today. And that will go out to all the participants and anyone else who is interested. It'll also be posted on our new website for the RESPECT initiative, www.respect.international, and you can find all the recordings for this webinar series here. This webinar is going to be the introduction to a series of 6 webinars on this topic, and what we're going to be looking at, and Tuesday is going to frame the conversation more for us today as the moderator, looking at how different forms of transnational organized crime issues intersect with human trafficking, and what is the impact of these different intersections on the private sector. So we've got a great lineup of different experts here today who are representing different stakeholder communities who are encountering this problem on a regular basis, and they'll be explaining all of the different complexities and intersections of how human trafficking really fits in to this whole web of transnational organized crime issues. And again, what is the impact for the private sector? So today I want to thank also, in addition to my colleagues from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime and the International Organization for Migration, we all of us together make up the RESPECT initiative, which again, we're going to be hearing more about in a few minutes from Tuesday Ratana. I also additionally want to thank the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center from George Mason University and Dr. Louise Shelley and Casey Crenard there, who are helping support particularly this webinar series, and we're very grateful for their expertise and thoughtful feedback for this webinar series. So thank you, TRAC. We're thrilled to have you again as part of this webinar series. And now I would like to introduce Tuesday Ratana, who is going to be moderating our session today. She is the Deputy Director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and she's also a Senior Advisor at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, where she's coordinating research for not 1, not 2, but 5 organized crime observatories in Africa. She was formerly the director of CT Morse, which is an independent policy and monitoring unit for the EU's programs in counterterrorism, and she also served for 12 years as a policy specialist in many capacities in the UN system. She's also an expert on fragile states and development, working both with state civil society and at the community level to strengthen resilience to transnational threats, promote sustainable development, and the rule of law. She's authored a number of policy-oriented publications and academic reports in conjunction with leading institutions such as the UN, World Bank, and the OECD, looking at all of these various topics, including organized crimes, evolution and impact in Africa, human smuggling, and illicit financial flows, as well as crime, terrorism, security, and development. She also has a forthcoming publication with the OECD. You can see it there. And she's also the co-author of 2 other works, including Migrant, Refugee, Smuggler, Savior, a book published in 2016, looking at the role of smugglers in Europe's migration crisis. She also holds 3 master's degrees, again, not 1, not 2, but 3, in business administration, public administration, and MSc in security, conflict, and international development. And she's based in Geneva, Switzerland with her family. So Tuesday, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina, and thank you for the bio and thank you for the introduction. It is a great pleasure to be here at the start of this, which is actually our 5th webinar series, as Christina said, and for the GI to moderate what is beginning a conversation on how human trafficking intersects with other forms of transnational organized crime and what impact that has for the private sector who are seeking to respond. But if you will all give me the license, this is a very special webinar for us for another reason, which is because it is the first time we will launch the RESPECT initiative and run these webinars officially under its banner and branding. Normally, and for those of you who've joined us on these conversations before, we'd each talk about our own organization. But now we're here to talk about RESPECT, the Responsible and Ethical Private Sector Coalition Against Trafficking. This is a new initiative that our 3 organizations, the Global Initiative, IOM, and Babson, have set up and have been building over the last 2 years as what we hope will become a hub, one-stop shop, and forum for private sector, different members of parts of the private sector to work together, to learn lessons, to dialogue and share on ways to combat human trafficking. The establishment of the RESPECT initiative has very much been generated from the lessons that we've learned through running these webinars since 2015, for example, but also from a quite exhaustive stakeholder needs assessment process that we undertook over the course of 2016 and 2017. So if you will allow me 1 minute to explain RESPECT and introduce it to you all, I will then move straight into this webinar where we have an extraordinarily distinguished and very engaging panel to follow. So if you will forgive us, as Christina said, RESPECT is an online portal primarily. You can find it at www.respect.international. It is an online resource center dedicated initially to the private sector on human trafficking. It has a resource library that we have pulled together over nearly 2 years now of over 1,000 different reports, evidence-based reports, analysis, policy tools, toolkits, legal analysis on different aspects of human trafficking and its impact on the private sector and private sector responses and practices. It also showcases some original work that the RESPECT initiative partners have been bringing together, interviews, Q&As, case studies and experiences of different private sector entities, as well as, of course, you will find all of the past webinar recordings and reports that we've put together. So this is our initial platform. As RESPECT grows, we expect it to continue to bring together and share knowledge and good practices. We are working with different parts of the private sector on commissioned work to bring together industry-specific case studies, to convene a number of meetings and forums, and to do special investigative work. We are very excited about this partnership. We hope that RESPECT will contribute significantly to the global debate and movement to try and address the challenges of modern slavery. Little screenshot there of the portal. It is very accessible. It is very much designed to be an easy way to access and understand where the status quo is in terms of knowledge and debates. You can search by the challenge that you have as a private sector entity. You can search by region. You can search by the type of tool. It's very interesting, so I do encourage you all to check it out and do us a favor. And if you do have feedback that you would like to share about the RESPECT initiative, what it could do, how we could make the portal and its tools more useful, we would gratefully take it. Christina's already given you a little bit of an overview of the RESPECT webinar series looking back since 2015, so I won't do that now. But I will say that we've been incredibly thrilled on how this RESPECT webinar series has grown over the last 5 years. Now, I can see now that we have some 70 attendees online today. Back when we began, it looks more like 7. But and we see now, 150, 200 registrations regularly at the webinars and many hundreds of downloads of the recordings. So clearly here, with the panelists that we're bringing together, with the discussions that follow, with the experts who sign in, we're adding value to shared knowledge and shared understanding. So just to take a moment and introduce what we're trying to do here in 2018. As I said, what was very much learned from previous debates was the extent to which human trafficking is a primary crime facilitated by transnational criminal groups, but also a range of other actors, that it relies upon networks and webs, on institutions, and corporations with questionable ethics, with questionable ability to sort of have oversight over their supply chains. But often human trafficking is actually a secondary or a collateral activity that feeds on the back of other illicit industries. And that was what we wanted to try and explore over the course of the 2018 webinar series. We wanted to look at how the private sector may be seeking to address a primary threat from another form of organized crime, or alternatively, maybe trying to address human trafficking, but not seeing how different criminal flows are also interacting with it. Increasingly organized crime, they are networks, polycrime groups that take opportunities in any point of vulnerability, whether that's within a state or within a private sector or within an industry across the whole. These are no longer isolated crimes, they're no longer isolated groups. And so what we are hoping to bring together here today is to make that our understanding of human trafficking and its linkages to other forms of crime more robust. We have 5 topics upcoming. The next one will be on the extractive industry and the environmental and human rights challenges that often interplay with it. We'll be drawing from case studies from across the globe, from Latin America, Africa, as well as how corporate entities are dealing with those challenges. We will then be looking at illegal fishing, how environmental crime, illegal fishing, and human trafficking have intersected. In fact, human trafficking is prevalent almost universally on a 1-to-1 ratio with every incident of illegal fishing that has been documented. And we are increasingly pushing to show illegal fishing, which is often seen as a regulatory problem, actually as a transnational organized crime. In our May webinar, we'll be looking at the counterfeit tobacco trade and illicit whites and how the tobacco industry is dealing with the intersection between counterfeiting, the illegal distribution of tobacco, and human trafficking. And then finally, we'll be coming back to a theme that we have spoken about before in past webinars, which will be cybercrime and online exploitation, and how criminal networks, but also opportunists, are using the internet to enable crime. So we hope that you'll find that this overview webinar, which talks more generally about private sector challenges and the illicit economy, will set the stage for these more detailed debates, and we really hope that you will join us over the course of this 6-session season. Finally, if you are more interested in more information about RESPECT itself, you can go to the website. You can email us at secretariat@respect.international. You can contact any one of the 3 consortium partners. We are looking for private sector entities to engage with us, to explain to us what their experiences are, what their needs are, and we are looking for RESPECT Global Business Ambassadors, a sponsorship scheme by which we can expand the portal and increase the number of services that we're able to offer. So thank you very much for letting me have the opportunity to plug RESPECT. And now, on behalf of RESPECT, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to our first webinar of the season, 2018, Human Trafficking and Transnational Crime. Our first speaker today will be Ambassador Adam Blackwell. He is, it is with an immense honor that we have him joining us today. He is currently the Vice President at the Development Services Group, a consultancy focused on building high-value networks to help professionals build capacity, forge partnerships, and affect meaningful behavioral and policy change. But Adam comes with a very distinguished career. He was previously the Secretary for Multi-Dimensional Security from the Organization of American States, where he served for 6 years, focusing on different forms of transnational crime and their impact in the Americas. In his capacity with the Organization for American States, he was the chair of the Meta Council on the Illicit Economy for the World Economic Forum. He will be presenting today some of the findings of that World Economic Forum process on the state of the illicit economy, challenges to global governance and systems within the framework of the 4th Industrial Revolution. I've had a preview look at his PowerPoint. It looks really interesting. Very engaging set of issues. And so I will not take up any more of your time now. And we'll pass over to Adam for his presentation. And then we'll be back to you again afterwards for our next speaker. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you very much, Tuesday. That was a wonderful introduction and a perfect segue to my presentation. I would just like to say that at the outset, obviously, nobody can deal with a subject this important and this complex in 7 or 8 minutes of this presentation. And I should also say, I don't know whether any of them are on the phone or on the webinar, but I was very fortunate to lead a wonderful group, or to chair a wonderful group at the World Economic Forum, which was made up of people from the private sector. We had Hewlett Packard, we had Steve Brand, who does a lot of work on wildlife. We partnered with the Mining Council. We had, of course, Christina Bain. So we had a really a very, very high-level group that helped pull all of this together. I'm not going to spend much time on the challenges of the the context of the presentation, but just to say that even if you look at the 2018 risk report that the World Economic Forum has just released, there's a lot of focus on the fraying of what they call the multilateral rules-based approach. And you know, we see this in many of our instances. And one of the things that we had mentioned as a group at the World Economic Forum, you know, wouldn't it be great if some of these issues and initiatives could be put into new international, multinational trade agreements like the TPP, for example. The World Economic Forum was also focusing on how to manage, if you will, the fourth industrial revolution so that it didn't manage us, the impact of massive networks of technology and connectivity, the Internet of Things. And this is really what I think gave birth to this concept of a meta-council, which brought together this very interesting group of people from all walks of life that looked at this in a transversal way. And finally, you know, the culmination of a lot of this work was the publication of our paper, The State of the Illicit Economy, which I believe came out last year. This is, and again, I have to thank the World Economic Forum for this slide. This really emanated from our first meeting of the Meta Council, where we sat down with maybe 100 people from different councils in Abu Dhabi to try and come to grips with what people thought of, or how people defined the illicit economy. We knew instinctively that we needed to try and do some mapping and to try and hone it down, or we would never be able to produce any kind of useful work. And as you can see here, we were literally and figuratively all over the map. But I think one of the most important conclusions of this slide is this idea that we can't continue to use old tools and old approaches to these new problems, and that we really need to think about taking a systemic and systematic approach as we work through the illicit economy and all of the impacts of the illicit economy. So moving from here, we worked as a group to try and hone down and come together with some objectives for the Meta Council, and they're very similar to your initiative with RESPECT that you've just announced this morning. And the first one was to clearly demonstrate the scale and the scope of the illicit economy without getting lost in the definitional issues. Previous iterations of the Meta Council had tried to define and develop metadata sets, but frankly had not been successful. And so we really decided that, look, you know, we're going to work with what we've got. We're not going to worry about defining it. We're simply going to talk about this other member of the G7 countries that is, you know, probably as big as some of the bigger members, growing faster than the regular or illicit economies, but is also not beholden to any of the rules, borders, boundaries of any of the other economies. So this is kind of the approach we took at Davos, is to talk really about a G7 country and how to come to grips with this, this growing problem. The other thing that we thought was very important was to do like you did with RESPECT, was to do an environment scan and develop a matrix of what is happening. We really didn't. We wanted to be very humble and understand that there are a number of initiatives underway. Almost all multilateral organizations, almost all business groups have some piece of the illicit, are working on some pieces of the illicit economy. And we wanted to develop that mapping of what was taking place and look for the gaps and to try and figure out how we could bring that together in a easy-to-use area where different stakeholders, different groups could have simple and easy access. And then the third piece of this was we wanted to develop pathfinders that could help us develop some of the approaches in a little more detail and look for the areas of convergence as we worked across these 4 areas. And we chose very carefully, we wanted to choose areas that had a human impact, so human trafficking, a product impact, counterfeiting, an environmental impact, illicit mining, and obviously something that connects all of them, illicit financial flows. And that's really where we decided to focus our efforts on those 4 broad areas. And as you'll see in this slide, this is how we were able to, and again, I want to thank the World Economic Forum for the great artwork. I could never have done something like this. This is how we presented the strategy behind the Meta Council in Abu Dhabi or Dubai, I can't remember which one, but and also at Davos. So again, as I said earlier, the framing and the scanning and trying to get all of the information that we could of what is underway, understanding the underlying principles, social vulnerabilities, government institutional fragilities, and accelerants like technology, and to then work at building coalition across all of the stakeholders based on the right assumptions, the right policies, the right incentives to develop the right outcomes. And this was really the kind of approach we took, and in developing what I would call our coalition of the willing to work with us. As we began this work and as we developed our approaches, we really came across what I would call 4 areas of convergence. And I think you've identified some of those in your presentation on RESPECT, and I don't think I'm saying anything new here. But what technologies can be used to enhance the impact and efficiency of the authorities in confronting criminal actors, and what technology platforms need to be interoperable for them to achieve the intended impact. I mean, one of the things that I have been working on for the past couple of years is with the World Customs Organization to try and help bridge right holders or brand holders, if you will, and information about their products with customs authorities to develop a one-stop shop so that customs authorities don't have to go to thousands of different right holders or brand holders to validate product identity to try and tackle the problem of counterfeits. Very difficult to get right holders or brand holders to offer up, if you will, their proprietary information, and equally difficult to get customs officials who are trying to move containers ever faster, ever quicker, and not delay business. So, you know, this is one of the areas where technology can help, also be a hindrance, but and we're still struggling with the WCO on this. The second area of convergence is how can legislation, treaties, and conventions be advanced to ensure that there is some form of global governance that can deal with these new forms of crime that defy traditional definitions and jurisdictions. And I can only say that this past July, I was at the Interpol World Conference at the Interpol Innovation Center in Singapore, and they asked me to give the concluding talk to this convention, and this was frankly one of the common themes across almost all of the presentations during this Interpol conference. How, in goodness names, are we going to deal with some of these issues if we're still talking about mutual legal assistance treaties, which are painfully slow, and this kind of coordinated approach to things like cybercrime are just not evolving fast enough. The third area of convergence is how do we develop awareness across citizens and consumers? So using my same example for counterfeiting products, how do we enable citizens with a cell phone to scan a product to understand whether it's a legitimate product or not? How do we enable citizens to understand that buying fake products may look good walking down the street, but on the other hand, they're helping to fund criminal organizations, terrorist groups, and drive other areas of crime which are perhaps less, in which they would be perhaps less interested. And the fourth area of convergence is how do we develop and how do we identify the areas of common interest and reward? How do you make sure that there are the right incentives for business to do the right things? How do you encourage businesses to auto-disclose or self-disclose that their systems have been hacked? Or how do you work with businesses to identify areas where their products are being counterfeited or where they sense risk? Everybody is very apathetic to coming forward and to identifying these issues. So again, I think the RESPECT initiative is a great example of how we can help enable businesses to shine, frankly, to shine the light on those who are doing the right thing. So rather than shame businesses to try and name and fame, I think is the right approach. And the last piece here, and a lot of this stems from a lot of work that we did in reviewing what other groups and other areas had done, and we came up with what I would call 4 broad guiding principles that I think are really important in any approach we want to take in trying to stop the illicit economy or impact the illicit economy. And the first one is, if we're going to stop illicit activity, we need to make sure that the associated illicit activity is easy and simple. I was recently in Colombia talking to somebody in terms of crop exchange and eradication, and Campesino said to me, when I sell my illicit product, the bad guys come and do all of the work for me. They do all of the marketing. They do all of the payment. I don't have to worry about getting anything to market. It's all done for me. If the government wants me to replace my illicit crops with licit ones, then they need to make sure that I can get my products to market in the same way. The second guiding principle, and this is done all the time in the technology industry with ethical hacking, but we need to think a little bit like a criminal. And we actually had a session in Abu Dhabi where we asked everybody to think like a criminal and to design or reverse engineer, if you will, a business process from a criminal perspective. It was fascinating. This is why I think this became one of the guiding principles as we moved forward. The third is, often there's what I call regulatory arbitrage. companies move to places where the rules are simpler and easier to get around, that does not mean that we should allow illicit or corrupt practices to take place. So, I mean, this is really what we meant by number 3. And number 4, you know, transparency requires analytics. We need to know what is happening where. We need to be able to have and develop the data that can be used to help track and trace these problems. Again, going back to the counterfeiting example I used earlier, if the private sector, right holders, can give us enough information to identify their products without giving away brand secrets, then we can enable customs officials to try and identify those counterfeit products. If the information is too whitewashed or too anonymized that we can't use it, then we're not going to be successful. So Christina and Tuesday, I am going to stop there and hand it over to the next speaker. I hope I haven't gone too long.
No, Adam, thank you very much indeed. That was a superb overview to looking at how the thinking from on behalf of the private sector has evolved over these issues. And the guiding principles, I think, are a very good framing for some of our subsequent discussions. Sorry, Christina told me and I forgot to do it, but if any of our now 72 attendees who are listening online wish to ask questions to the speakers or put questions into the discussion, please do so in the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner. We can give a couple of minutes for questions immediately after the presentations, or we can do the whole lot at the end. So I guess, Adam, since I forgot to invite people to question while you were speaking or before, we will move straight into the next presentation and then maybe have a short opportunity to have some dialogue with the participants online immediately after the next presentation.
Okay, I'm going to mute because I'm dealing with, as you can probably tell, with a wicked cold here. So.
Oh, I just thought you sounded very husky. Marlena Dietrich, in male version. Anyway, thank you again, Adam, for the excellent presentation. It is now my enormous pleasure to introduce Peter Warwick. Peter is the Director of Anti-Money Laundering and FinTech Advisory at the Bank of Montreal, BMO. He has an incredibly distinguished career in sort of developing the AML, CFT, so anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism discipline per se. He worked before the Bank of Montreal at the Royal Bank of Canada, and these two institutions together have really been pioneers in the AML field, such that they're sometimes described as the AML universities. So his work with managing special projects, he advises on major anti-money laundering, countering finance of terrorism investigations, and he is a certified Bitcoin professional. And I'm hoping that over the course of this presentation, we'll find out what that means and how rich he got in the Bitcoin boom. Prior to joining RBC, he was working in the law enforcement sector in the UK, where he has brought, I think, his holistic approach and understanding to transnational organized crime issues into the private sector. Peter is presenting today a really interesting, innovative project on public-private partnership. It's called Project Intersect. It was launched in Canada last year in 2016, sorry, that's good, 2 years ago now, with its first efforts to counter human trafficking. But very interestingly, it has expanded its operations to deal with financial crime, mass marketing, organ trafficking, and fentanyl trafficking. So a very diverse set of illicit markets. And it will be very interesting over the course of this presentation to highlight how approaches to countering different forms of transnational crime, of which human trafficking is one, can be applied across the board. So Peter, without further ado, I will pass over to you. And thank you very much for taking the time to join us. As I failed to say before, if you do have questions for our speakers, anybody online is most welcome to put them into the chat, and we will moderate those into a discussion immediately following. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tuesday. I'm not sure if I have control of the slides, but if we could bring up the first slide, please, while I'm speaking. I was intrigued by Adam's presentation there, and loved the artwork, Adam.
Peter, you do have control.
Thank you. You've given me some ideas there. Trying to change the slide. No, if you could bring the slide up, please. I don't seem to have control. Anyway, while we're waiting for the slides, a huge thank you. It's a real honor to be asked to present with such esteemed colleagues. Thank you, Christina, Tuesday, Babson College, and my peer presenters. It's going to be difficult to do Project Protect Justice in 8 minutes, but we'll see what we can do. I'm still not. I still don't have control of the slides. Here we go. So Project Protect, I'm going to be talking about that. I'm delighted to see on the line some of the actual anti-money laundering investigators, both in Canada and the United States, that have been involved in this ongoing project and have been contributors to it. In simple terms, the project is unique and the first model, certainly in Canada and in some parts of the world, of public-private partnership. And as Tuesday has said, it was launched in January 2016 and was initially focused on human trafficking, but has since been leveraged to address, as Tuesday said, financial crime, organ trafficking, and fentanyl trafficking. So it's a model of public-private partnership, and our partners include, but are not limited to, the major Canadian banks. So we're fortunate in Canada that we only have 6 major banks, so it's a lot easier to work closely together. Law enforcement at all levels, from federal to municipal. When the project first started, what we saw was law enforcement working in silos. And by looking at the financial transactions provided by banks, it provided a much more holistic picture of what a particular trafficker was doing, not just in one state, but across Canada and indeed into the US and Europe and beyond. Central to the success of the partnership, in which we're all equal partners, as opposed to some models around the world which are driven by law enforcement. Central to that is FinTrack, which is Canada's equivalent of FinCEN in the United States, and is Canada's financial intelligence unit. Without them, the project couldn't operate, and it continues to operate to this day. Obviously, NGOs, non-government organizations and charities, including but not limited to the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking, of which I'm a board member, and our goals are, 1, to end human trafficking, and secondly, to put in place a national hotline in Canada, which we hope will be achieved this year. A national hotline similar to that operated by Polaris in the US, Mexico and the UK, and indeed one of the, I'll call them partners in Project Protect, in a parallel sense, has been Polaris in the United States. The government of Canada, particularly the Department of Public Safety, who are ultimately accountable for the safety of the public, including victims of human trafficking. Since the project started, we've brought on board credit unions, money services businesses, accounting firms, for instance, Grant Thornton, who have been doing some tremendous work in raising awareness, producing published materials, hosting breakfast seminars. Can't say a big enough thank you to them. And most importantly of all, victims. Often the victim is ignored in terms of the consultation, but we partner with victims and hear their stories and learn from them. And what we learn from them is often new to us. They can really keep us informed. We've had huge technology support with partners like IBM and Verifin, and there are many others. The goal of the project, pretty simple. Again, it's an equal partnership. Last year, I co-presented on stage at the UN workshop on human trafficking held at Grace Farms in the United States. And people around the world seem to be amazed that a bank could be on stage with a regulator co-presenting in partnership. It seems to be a first for many people. To us, it's a no-brainer. The partnerships we've developed are respective of each other's roles, but focused on the common goal of addressing human trafficking. So the objectives are twofold, pretty simple. To increase awareness of human trafficking amongst the members of respective institutions and beyond. Just within the 6 banks, for instance, we can reach 300,000 employees, each of whom have families and can spread the word. And in a country with a population of 30-something million, that's a pretty good start. And secondly, on the enforcement side, to provide law enforcement with the intelligence they need, the financial intelligence they need to do their job. And that's done through suspicious transaction reporting, called SAR reporting in the United States, whereby the banks and partners identify suspicious transactions related to human trafficking, feed that information to FinTrack, who analyzes it, enhances it, and then disseminates it to dedicated law enforcement units. And these units have really increased and evolved greatly since the start of the project. Many police forces did not have dedicated units and now do, and are a point of contact for FinTrack. One of the first potential roadblocks when we launched this project, and the project was launched basically at the request of a victim who made an appeal to the banks to do something to help, and we stepped up. But one of the first challenges that was raised was the issue of privacy and the sharing of information. We very quickly realized we didn't need to share any personal information, no names, no addresses, because what we had done in the pre-work of the project was identified such strong indicators of human trafficking in Canada, the landscape of which is somewhat different to the US, but in Canada, most of the human trafficking relates to sex trafficking. And the indicators we developed were so strong that we didn't need names. Through automated transaction monitoring of customers' accounts and profiles, we were able to, and continue to be able to, fairly quickly and accurately identify suspected traffickers to focus in on them and further review. The other key thing, strategy to achieve, was that in increasing awareness, FinTrack would publish typologies, operational alerts on a dynamic basis, so not once every 3 years or something, but updated regularly. And as one partner, for instance, identified a new indicator, a new typology, this would be immediately shared with the other partners who would go away and work independently towards a common goal. My point being, everybody on the same page at the same time. 2 years in, the project has been hugely successful, as I'll show you shortly, in many ways, not just in arrests, identification of victims, etc., but in raising awareness, not just amongst the public, but amongst law enforcement, amongst the prosecution, really across the board. So some numbers, people like numbers. So prior to the launch of the project on January 1st, 2016, so in the year and years before, there were 400 reports submitted by banks, etc., to FinTrack. In the first year after the project launched, that number increased 500% to 2,000, which in itself is significant. I just got the latest figures in for 2017, and the number more than doubled yet again. So that's about an 845% increase in 2 years from when the project started. And importantly, the SDRs are coming from across Canada, and the quality of the information, the intelligence in those SDRs is just insanely high. It's from, in 2015, it might be a couple of lines of analysis. Now, the analysis is detailed in pages long, a real intelligence that law enforcement can utilize. So that's fine, all this intelligence going into FinTrack, but what does FinTrack do with it? So prior to the project launch, in total, there were 19 disclosures made to law enforcement prior to the project concerning human trafficking. Between January and 16, December 17, that number has increased almost 1,500% to 276 disclosures, whereby FinTrack is saying to law enforcement, this person fits all the criteria of being a trafficker, here are their victims, here are their financial transactions, here's their money, this is how it's all happening. Prior to the project launch, again, roughly 50% of the disclosures were made proactively by FinTrack. So what that means is, in 50% of cases, unless law enforcement asks FinTrack, do you have information on somebody, they wouldn't get it. That figure now, and turned very quickly after the project launched, is 80%. So 80% proactive disclosures, in many cases telling law enforcement, informing them of information that they did not previously know. And as I said, the results have been tremendous in terms of arrests, identification of traffickers and victims, not just in Canada, but internationally. A number of missing people have been located as a result of this. And investigations, law enforcement investigations now continue to include focus on money laundering and going after the money and trying to take the onus of the victim having to testify in court, where instead you can go after the money, which hurts them far more. So I think I've already answered this question, how did we achieve this? The huge piece is education and awareness. The work myself and many, many other people have done over these 2 years in spreading the word, raising awareness is just impossible to document on a number of slides. But it includes conferences, presentations from groups as small as 20 people to groups as large as 2,500 people. A lot of national and international media attention, presentations involving schools, churches, communities. We've presented at the UN, the Vatican. In fact, I've just been asked to go back to the Vatican in March to talk about Project Protect in respect of their ethics in action in modern slavery work that the Vatican's doing. FATF have seen the project as an example of best practice. The Egmont group of country financial intelligence units I presented for Interpol. Quick story, actually, March last year I presented in St. Lucia to the Caribbean human trafficking units and talked about Bitcoin, which is used for back page ads, etc. There were people there from Jamaica who had not really heard of Bitcoin before, and then in September of last year, some 8 months later, they had a big takedown arrest operation in Jamaica in which Bitcoin cryptocurrency was involved. So it's good. I'd like to think I had a part of that. My professional association, ACAMS, Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists. I mean, the work ACAMS has done and continues to do across the world, spreading the word, holding meetings, conferences, keeping the subject alive is just huge. And it's just huge. And the other thing we've done is develop pretty sophisticated transaction monitoring scenarios, so automatic monitoring of accounts and transactions using the indicators we've developed and continue to develop. And that's, the conversion rate between those alerts to being the real thing is sometimes as high as 80%, which is huge. But ultimately, it's just working together towards a common goal and breaking down previous silos of good intentioned effort. And as I said, crucially, the involvement of the regulator as an equal partner, as opposed to a standoff partner, is huge, and it just continues. It just keeps going. So I think I've said enough, and I'll hand over, I think, back to Tuesday. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you so much. I think this is really very useful presentation of a very actual practical initiative, and one that has already demonstrated results. And I think, for us to see that there are lessons learned, that there are clear successes is already very rewarding. But I must say, from my perspective, the appreciation of the time that you've taken to then disseminate those results in other jurisdictions to apply the similar approaches to different forms of crime is really a model practice. So expect us Respect Fellows to start harassing you to write something up for our website. Once again, we'll make one more call to who is our third and last presenter. It's a great pleasure for me personally to introduce Robin, since he is a senior fellow with the Global Initiative in our global network of experts. Robin will be presenting a report that he has authored in a process that he has led with us over the last year, nearly a year and a half now, which was to how organized crime as a whole impacts on the private sector. So while Robin is a former partner at KPMG, where he managed a quite extensive series of projects estimating and responding to global anti-illicit trade for a number of sectors, pharmaceutical, tobacco, and drink industries, he has taken that sort of broader perspective and understanding of private sector industries and their operations, and would try to look systematically across 6 different sectors, how they are experiencing organized crime, how it's affecting them, and how they're responding to it, with the hope of then this sitting as a baseline to a better form of responses. I'm not going to steal too much of Robin's thunder, because that would be mean. But I really find that the process that we went through over the past year, which was quite exhaustive and included a number of interviews with different professionals from different sectors in different parts of the world, came across with some very clear findings, not only how human trafficking interrelates with other kinds of crime, but actually the extent to which that even the private sector itself has not properly quantified the costs of organized crime to their business. So Robin, I'll turn over to you now. I hope that you have your clicker ready and you have control over your PowerPoint presentation, and look forward to you sharing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Tuesday. I'm just checking you can hear me okay?
Yep, no problems.
Good. Okay. Look, I'll crack on because I think the agenda is pretty tight this afternoon, and I've got sort of 8 to 10 minutes, and I appear to have about 13 slides, so that doesn't bode well. So the only way to cover that is to go quickly. And I'm just going to pull out of the analysis we did a couple of kind of key learnings. I'd love to dive into the individual sectors Tuesday talked about, but I think the main thing is to try and draw out the sort of bigger lessons. And so I'm going to click through on the slides on the screen. Just starting, we started this process a year ago now, a year and a quarter ago, and we were kicked off by a private sector reference group at the Web Initiative, which brought together people from Cisco and DHL and Standard Life different sectors to get their view of how was organised crime affecting their industries and how were they able to respond to it. And perhaps most importantly, how was cooperation working between them and the law enforcers and the policymakers. So we did a bit of a tour d'horizon of these 6 sectors. I have contacts from my own network in most of those 6, and Global Initiative have those too. So we conducted interviews and a literature review. And as I flick through this, you can see, first thing to say is that sectors, these different sectors have either become sort of enablers or targets. And we broke down the criminal activity that we found in the private sector and focused very much on those areas that were mentioned the most by our colleagues in the private sector. And they were, as you can see, crimes like asset misappropriation, as you'd expect, this huge slug of counterfeit and contraband goods that affects consumer and industrial markets. Fraud and corruption is still a giant area. And then the enabling crimes of money laundering, cybercrime, and human trafficking all played very varying but interesting parts in this patchwork. What's quite interesting, if you look at the scale though, on this slide number 4, is that this is the total size of the crime, by the way, not just the private sector impact. And these numbers, whilst not perfect, they're helpful to give you a sense of scale. In terms of resetting people's focus on this crime, it's worth just pausing on this. The Institute of Economics and Peace claim that the financial cost of terrorism is over 52 billion in 2014, whereas we calculated the financial cost of crime at 870 billion a year. That's more than 6 times the amount of official development assistance, and it's close to 7% of world's exports of merchandise. And nobody is arguing that there should be less focus on terrorism, but there were 28,000 deaths due to terrorist activity in that year, and we believe 256,000 individuals were killed due to crime. So that scale of crime, both in terms of lives lost and businesses affected and money taken out of economies where it should be going to the neediest, is incredibly significant, and we think slightly undercooked in terms of overall policy focus. So that's slide 4. Just moving on now to slide 5. As you can see, that patchwork of crime occurs very differently according to the different sectors we're talking about. We looked at those 6 across the top of that slide, financial services through to consumer goods and so on. It does show the difference between asset and service-based sectors. So it highlights differences in ways that transnational organized crime groups are using different sectors to their own ends. So cybercrime, that's hitting technology as well, but also cybercrime in transport is very significant, as it is in financial sector. Counterfeit has a huge prevalence in consumer goods and health because that's physical product that's easily taken out of supply chains, relatively easily. Construction is a sort of perfect storm of organized crime in that it's asset heavy, it's public sector contract based, it's geographically diverse, and it's active in developing areas and very people heavy. So it has a very strong asset misappropriation flavor and a very strong human trafficking flavor. And technology is transforming every area of life and every area of crime, as we've heard a great deal about from sort of cyber criminal experts over the last couple of months. So the patchwork is very different. Criminals are very clever about how they use the private sector. But then if you look at how private sector actually incur losses themselves, the revenue impact to them personally is very different, with up to $1 in every 100 being lost to transactional OC activity. This is from a survey of senior global executives, and it's a percentage of real revenue lost to crime. And we can see elements of an inverse relationship. You'll see a lower financial sector impact, but a higher money laundering numbers. So you have here a lower impact on the actual profit and loss statements of a bank, but at the same time, you have incredibly high compliance efforts and regulatory efforts being paid by the financial sector to combat money laundering. So it's not as simple as looking only at this financial loss graph. which we mentioned earlier. Industry recognises the cost to industry is much lower than the total crime size, but there's a real correlation between those that are suffering asset misappropriation, which is closest to the total size. For example, in construction, where their 0.6% is largely made up of losing assets. Just moving on to the next slide, the question is, for a lot of these sectors, are the crimes being done to them, or are they being used as conduits or enablers? So in a conduit or enabler might be facilitating crime completely unwittingly and maintaining a costly monitoring regime. For example, if we look at the SARS program in the US, that's the Special Activity Reports, which are a mandatory part of financial reporting. That regime is estimated to cost up to $3 billion. And we'll talk in a moment about the efficacy of that expenditure. Certain sectors, particularly consumer goods, pharmaceutical and technology, place a significant attention on illicit trade rather than organised crime, but actually they're talking about the same thing. And we want them to change some of their language around that, because organised criminals are the ones organising illicit supply chains in sort of 95% of the cases. In the transport sector, they're clearly both targets of crime, and the 85% of cargo thefts, by the way, are during road transport. So the road transport industry is massively overrepresented in terms of crime, very heavily targeted. That's a real Achilles heel for that sector. And we'll see in a moment why we think they've tackled that crime more fully than other sectors. Just moving on now. Organised crime's impact on the private sector is growing, not shrinking. So we think this is a bit of an unsung story, but Europol agree with us at least. Crime no longer is balaclavas and baseball bats, but it's a growing professional area of crime. The news cycle is dominated by terrorism, and the perception of violent crime, as you can see on the left of this slide, is actually going down in most Western economies, including, as shown here, the USA. But the actual criminal levels, anybody who's been watching Mafia, which is based on a book by Misha Glenny, will completely concur with this. The actual levels of crime are rocketing upwards at a time when violent crime, and therefore visible crime, is coming down. So professional crime has gone up and it's shifted towards business, and crime is seen now as a professional activity. Some of those examples there: 40% increase in modern slavery, cargo theft increased 70% between 2011 and 2013, counterfeit and contraband increased by 10.7% compound annual growth rate between 2007 and 2013. So these are all signs of a growth industry. The next point to make really is that despite my having spoken mostly here about a very Western phenomenon, a phenomenon which is affected and run largely by, talks about largely by major Western companies, the impact of crime is disproportionately felt in the global South. And in that sense, we've seen sweatshops flourishing in Southeast Asia, trafficking of labour and sex workers originating predominantly in Africa, Asia and Eastern Europe, and corruption in natural resources damaging production in Africa. In Nigeria, a UNODC study revealed that 77% of anti-malarial drugs were non-compliant with basic quality measures, and most offered no active ingredient. So from malaria, which is a fast-acting disease, 120,000 people are reported or estimated to die each year because of this fake malarial problem. So this predominantly Western-led crime has a disproportionately severe effect on the global South. Just finishing off that point on slide 10, corruption in paradise. The impact of this is matched by the greater risk of operating in the global South, and the attack surface for transnational organised crime has been increased by the process of globalization rather than decreased overall. So what can we glean from this public and private sector reaction to this very significant rise in crime? Well, there are really, really few examples, as slide number 11 shows you, very few examples of successful public and private sector cooperation. Although some are privately sharing good intelligence with public sector organizations in the pharma industry, the logistics and tobacco industries. But the private sector tends to complain that communication with law enforcement is very one way, and it's very focused on the stick of regulation rather than the carrot of cooperation. So, for example, 1.5 million suspicious activity reports were submitted in the US in 2009, and when we did a UK review, fewer than 1% of these SARs were actionable. And seizures of laundered funds, again coming back to the financial sector, actual seizures of laundered funds, according to a study by Levi and Reuter, were only 0.2% of total laundered funds. So something around the money laundering legislation and the money laundering regulatory activity isn't working. There are very few inter-industry cooperation, as we've said here, but there are some great examples, although very rare examples, of organizations that are predominantly private sector created. For example, TAPA, the Transport Asset Protection Association, has created its own global security standards, and it shows that the members of TAPA apparently experience 3 times lower theft levels than non-members by just adhering to their own not regulation process, but accreditation process. So there are good examples, and there's some good examples in the financial sector as well. We've seen cooperation in JMLIT, the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force in the UK, has really improved cooperation between public sector investigators at the National Crime Agency and the Home Office and the international banks based in the City of London. But again, these are isolated examples, and what our report has really argued for is, as you can see from slide 12, a much greater level of cooperation. We want to see a much more concerted level of cooperation between the two sectors. We want to see joint events. We want to see a data observatory reducing, for example, illicit trade in tobacco. We've seen observatories can have a massive effect by shaming certain jurisdictions and indeed certain companies into curbing production that is being corrupted. There's also huge potential for technology to safeguard supply chains from organised crime, because we have now very cheap deployable track and trace technology done at a very, very low price per pack or per physical product. But very few examples exist of good physical supply chain security. We've seen some in India, a great example of an industry that was really at war with the fake pharmaceutical infiltrators. We see very, very few examples of that in other industries globally. So our campaign is to get this message out and give more and keep populating examples both of industries that care deeply about this, and we want to see less bad regulation and more productive cooperation. That I suspect is our strongest sort of argument in terms of moving this forward. And cooperation is very different from regulation. The regulation has a very one-sided flavour to the reporting, as we've seen with SARs, and cooperation is completely different. It's about creating a degree of trust between the public and private sectors, which allows for much better intelligence sharing and a much more adult relationship. So that's all I wanted to say. I see I've gone over my 8 minutes, so I will now be suitably admonished by the chair, as I deserve. But thank you for listening, and let's hope we can hear more from you. Thank you.
Robin, thank you so much. No admonishment for once. Only very much appreciate the time that you took to go over the report. At least I find when I read, and I've read this report, and if you do want to read it, it is on our website at www.globalinitiative.net. But what I find very striking, of course, when you look at the private sector and illicit trade and organized crime, the numbers are extraordinary. That we're talking trillions, there's no number that isn't a billion. But what I appreciated as you came through the recommendations is this highlight on, of course, that costs aren't only financial. And I would say if we're going to draw anything in and to lead us into a discussion around here on human trafficking, the costs of human trafficking are not measured in dollars, they're measured in lives and quality of life, as well as other impacts that it has more broadly on society. So I think we need to find a way within the space of the private sector conversation to, on the one hand, yes, it's about the bottom line. Yes, of course, it's about self-interest. It's about, accountability. It's also about victim protection. And what I think I hear a lot in these conversations, and it plays a little bit, is can we find a means by which we bridge the, okay, you're not just doing it for altruistic reasons, but there is a responsibility, but there's a cost. I think there's a linguistic or a nomenclature issue. And I would very much appreciate, as we go into this discussion, all three of our very sort of outstanding participants, presenters, who have tried to bridge that divide, who have tried to bring together public-private partners, to try and bring together NGO advocates and civil society, to bring together governments and regulators, as well as private sector interests, and what kind of language, what kind of incentives are needed to bring them around a common objective and move towards activity rather than just rhetoric. So if I could maybe ask you to reflect for a minute from your experience on that question, and then we have a couple of questions that have come in from the participants, which we will pepper out in a relatively quick succession. So going back to the beginning, perhaps, you might all three want to unmute yourselves at this point, but Adam, if you wanted to think a little bit about how we catalyze and break down public-private sector partnerships, I'd very much appreciate it.
Thank you. It's this is, I pointed out in one of our principles is exactly that question. How do you develop the right incentives for companies who know their products are being counterfeited, but are reluctant to come forward and do the right thing? And I'm always surprised when I'm at these events that we all seem to coalesce around this issue of how do you share information across platforms that does not get into the proprietary information of business, but on the other hand gives law enforcement enough information to be able to enforce the law or take action. And as I said earlier, at the meeting in Interpol World, I mean, that was one of the major conclusions of the meeting, that the police can't share information with the private sector, and the private sector thinks it's a one-way street. And by and large, that is one of the big challenges we have. We also have to look at the incentives for people to come forward and say, and demonstrate that they are being trafficked or that they're victim of some crime or other. And this is happening in the United States with fairly large numbers of displaced people who, for a variety of reasons, are reluctant to come forward. They have more fear of the authorities than they have of, it seems sometimes, of the criminal element. So I wish I had a response for you. I think that initiatives like RESPECT, initiatives like the one that Peter was mentioning, I get called PROTECT, I think it was. Those are that's the right approach. I think you need to name and fame companies, and people need to feel part of something and doing the right thing. But I don't have a golden or the simple answer, I'm sorry to say.
It's fair enough. Peter, do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, thank you. From a Project Protect model standpoint, I think the key thing for me, whether it be human trafficking, counterfeit goods, or whatever the crime is that's being addressed, I think traditionally these have been driven by law enforcement, and I think the secret of Project Protect in that model, and that type of model, is equal partnerships. So everybody having a voice at the table, one not being bigger than the other, every voice being heard, and again, equal partnerships. And then critical to that is the involvement of the regulator. So for instance, in the United States, it would be FinCEN, as an equal partner, not as a standoff partner who publishes a report once a year, but a partner that's engaged on a regular basis, face-to-face, at the table. So to me, it's all about equal partnerships and a common goal.
Thank you. Robin?
Sorry, yeah, just something for myself. I think public-private partnerships sounds like a very ideal kind of solution to this, but organized crime is traditionally such a sensitive area of public policy that it's very hard to create the sort of public-private partnership innovation in this particular segment. You know, my perspective is that governments might be very happy to enter into infrastructure deals in a public-private partnership. Ask them to enter into an intelligence partnership is a really different thing and takes you know, a hell of a lot of confidence by public policymakers that they can trust the private sector. So I still think we've got a little way to go in this particular segment to create something meaningful. I think there are a couple of examples, as in JNLit, but they're very, very few. And we need to be promoting them actively. And I know, you know, several people in government want to do that, and several people, of course, in private sector have been actively banging this drum for a long time.
Thank you. Robinson, stay on the line, don't unmute yourself, because I'm going to give you the first question that came in from one of our participants. Joe Webb asks you, she says that in your presentation you mentioned that financial services are a conduit for human trafficking crimes. As financial services touch on all of the industries, what more could this sector specifically do over and above the focus on anti-money laundering?
Yeah, that's a tough one, actually, because I wouldn't say that services are necessarily a real target for human traffickers in terms of placing personnel. I would say that unwittingly, as with many things, the financial sector is used by the criminals creating human trafficking chains. What I think could get better, and this is partly down to the public sector providing better guidance, is helping the financial sector spot potential traffickers and potential traffickers' business. At the moment, if you look at money laundering, it basically asks you to verify who your customer is at very great length. And then it asks you to literally report anything suspicious. And it's left to you as the poor financial sector employee to work out what suspicious means. I know this because I've had this training myself, because the organization I work for is, of course, regulated by the FSA. And it simply says, report everything that's suspicious. It leaves you with nothing. So the more we in the public sector can help really focus financial sector's ability to police their own business, the better this is going to get. And at the moment, I would say that's pretty minimal. So I would actually put the question back onto the public sector to help us spot what is a typical profile of the account of a human trafficker.
Fair question. I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer with an answer to that one. All right, fair enough. We'll leave that one then. Actually, well, the next question, oh, sorry, yes, is that Peter?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's different in the different jurisdictions. So I can really only speak to Canada, but in Canada, you have the sole operator, commonly, which is one person, one pimp, one trafficker, and I'm talking about sex trafficking here. Having said that, in certain communities you also have more organized groups and rings, particularly in the Asian community, I would say.
Peter, while you're on the line, a question was put to you from our online participants. They asked you what the Bank of Montreal's specific actions are in identifying suspected human traffickers and suspicious transactions to FinTrack. So it sounds like that would be a good follow-on from what you just said.
Well, specifically, the first thing we did and continue to do is raise awareness. So I'm talking everything from the front line, from the teller to the back end, the anti-money laundering investigators. So regarding the latter, they have to know what they're looking for. So we train them on the indicators of human trafficking, which would be when they're looking at accounts. And traffickers often use a victim's accounts as their operating account, as opposed to using their own account. So the activity in a victim's account, for instance, and this is something we learn from victims, it's not what you see as much as what you don't see. So you don't see normal activity, say for a female, buying normal things like groceries or cosmetics or stuff like that. You see things like paying for advertising online, paying for fast food, paying for travel, frequent travel, frequent accommodation, hotels, etc., frequent taxis and things like that. So those are the specific types of things we're looking for.
Okay, thank you. Next question is actually also yours, Peter, from Leticia Hernandez. She asks, on a separate subject, what are the potential impacts through Project Protect?
I missed everything you said after potential.
What is the potential impact that cryptocurrencies can have in the ability to identify STRs through Project Protect?
As opposed to potential impact, I think they're a really good opportunity to identify traffickers advertising on certain sites online. Some of the more famous ones will only accept cryptocurrency, for instance. So within the cryptocurrency space, for instance, on the Bitcoin blockchain, it's possible over time, using analytical tools such as chain analysis or elliptic, to start to identify wallet owners that are making payments in cryptocurrency to these sites. And then if you're able then to identify the owner of the wallet through social media network analysis, etc., put it all together, there's a pretty good chance you're either looking at a human trafficker or you're looking at an organized prostitution ring, which, depending on the country, may be illegal or illegal.
Thanks. The follow-up question on this use of cryptocurrencies, one of our Babson colleagues would like to know whether you're seeing an evolution in the use of cryptocurrencies from Bitcoin towards some of the newer ones like Ethereum. Do you see these gaining traction with criminal networks and human trafficking specifically?
I think for human trafficking, I think we're still probably talking about Bitcoin. For money laundering purposes, if I was a money launderer, I would be probably less interested in Bitcoin, which is somewhat traceable, and more interested in some of the privacy coins. Ethereum's not privacy, but coins such as Monero, for instance, or Zcash, which have built-in privacy features to make it a lot harder to identify where funds that came in from actually went, and vice versa.
Thank you. Moving away from the cryptocurrency questions. Adam, you might want to unmute right about now, because one of our participants online has asked whether or not the panel in general, but I'm going to make you do it first, could speak to the role of corruption and what role corruption has had in preventing public-private partnerships going forward. Adam? Hello? Okay, I'm going to assume. Oh, no.
Can you hear me?
I can now.
Sorry, I was going to say that I can really only speak with authority for the Americas, and I would just say that corruption is frankly the foundation of many of the issues that we're discussing. I always think of corruption as having four parts: the corrupt, the corruptors, tolerance, and impunity. And in the Americas, all of that is happening at once. And if you go back to some of the artwork I shared, you know, we identified very clearly government and institutional fragility as being one of the major issues in moving forward, and frankly creating the environment where people want to join the formal economy rather than stay in the shadows of the informal. And you know, there's examples of that all over the place, and many of the, you know, unfortunately many of the states within Mexico are now being run by cartels and you know, and other actors of the illicit economy. So I would say it's an absolute foundational piece to try and get this right.
Thank you. Do any of our other colleagues on the panel want to speak to the issue of corruption and its role as a bulwark against public-private partnerships?
I must have answered it well.
I think you did. Interesting. We just had another question come in, which I think speaks into this issue as well. And also, I think the Americas have a lot to offer in this regard, and this is an issue quite close to my heart personally. Toby McIntosh asks if the speakers have suggestions for how we could encourage and support more investigative journalism in these areas. And I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody online, but investigative journalism often becomes the flag bearer for integrity in corrupt states, and pay a very high price for that. So I would certainly welcome any responses from you as colleagues on how you feel the role of journalism could be strengthened and protected to respond to human trafficking and transnational crime.
Well, I would just say, Tuesday, that this is one of the major issues we have in the Americas. I've forgotten how many journalists have been killed this year in Mexico, but it's at six. It's at record numbers, and the lack of professional investigative journalism is quite worrying. The control of the news in very few hands is troubling. The kind of propagation of what now has become fake news and ways of covering up issues has become the rule rather than the exception. So I think you know, this is one of the areas where we need to invest a lot more in journalism school, journalism programs, protecting journalists, and hopefully developing and using technology. Frankly, some of the better information comes out from online media sources where there is some capability to protect the individuals, like Insight Crime, for example. But it is a problem area.
Unquestionably. I mean, at least in my experience, sorry, just to steal the floor, but at least in my experience, actually, often human trafficking is one of the first issues that journalism feels comfortable picking up, and its human cost always makes it a good story. But it's really building a culture that allows you to just dig down beyond the reporting of, you know, busts of brothels and other things into understanding the networks behind. The global initiative both alone and with our partners, have invested a lot in investigative journalism training. But the safety and security of journalists is so important, and the people who inform them really have become a priority.
But I would also say again, going back to my earlier point about interests, you know, if journalists are afraid to report on, say, counterfeit or fake pharmaceuticals because of pressure by big pharma to the, you know, business owner of the particular newspaper, then, you know, this is also part of the issue. So it's not just a question of security; it's a question of control and ownership and freedom to do the investigative work that we all need.
Absolutely. Robin, I don't know, since you're our expert on pharma, if you had anything you wanted to contribute on this point or in related ones?
Yeah, I think that journalism has a huge role to play. It's interesting because it's at a time when journalism as an industry is in kind of slow decline because of the you know, the move away from the print media and the traditional media channels towards informal media. So it's difficult to encourage when you know, owners of media groups and newspaper groups are experiencing declining revenues. It's very difficult to push them hard to cover more organized crime. That said, you know, as Adam said, there are some great examples of people turning journalism into a form of non-profit activity, such as Insight Crime. And Global Witness have done some very interesting, if controversial, reporting in natural resources crime. And I think more should and could be done. I think often, actually, the interest between these journalists and big business are often aligned, actually, because, you know, when I talk to people like GSK, they are as concerned about fake malarial drugs as anybody, not least because they are providing them to the African continent on a free basis, as paid for by Bill and Melinda Gates or the Global Fund, and yet many of those pharmaceuticals are being corruptly rerouted to areas where they're resold, despite being intended for free use at point of delivery. So actually, the interest between journalists and big businesses often are often similar. But I think we need more of an effort, as GI are making, to create our own channels of journalism. And this idea of a non-profit journalist pool raising awareness of organized crime, I think, is a very, very good one that people like Insight Crime have pioneered.
Perfect. Peter, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add on the issues that we've just discussed, or I'll move into the next question.
Yeah, I can't really speak to journalism, but I can speak to the story, I think, and what I see as an emerging risk, and equally an emerging opportunity for a good story, which journalists can go for. And that is the concept of supply chain due diligence. I think we're going to see a lot of more focus on that internationally, driven by the UN, and the need for what I call ethically enhanced due diligence on your supply chain. So the big companies, you know, where the source of the product, etc., and there's human trafficking involved. I believe in the US already, if it's a government contract over $500,000, there has to be some element of that by the company, by the contractor. I see that's going to be bigger, and I think that will lead to big stories, which hopefully journalists can then run with.
Indeed, let's hope so. I'm going to put up now the last question that I've got so far from the participants online. We are coming near to the end of our time, so last chance, I think, anybody who has a question to pop it in now, and then we can begin to wrap up for the evening, or in morning in other people's time zones. So a question from Carly Oboth. She asks, how do you encourage companies to take ownership of their role in facilitating, directly or indirectly, human trafficking without relying too heavily on industry schemes and programs? And then related to that, how do we get companies to be more honest in their public reporting about the challenges that they're facing and the strategies that they're employing to mitigate these risks?
I think it's Peter. I think I've kind of answered that in my last question.
Yeah, I would agree to a certain extent. Any of our other colleagues?
Yeah, it's Robin here. I think that's a really interesting question. I think that a good deal is happening in the world of big business to make them better global citizens. So there's a huge initiative that I've come across recently where global businesses such as Unilever and GSK and others are really trying to report what their progress is against, or rather their impact is on the success of the global sustainable development goals. And they see this as a crucial part of their ongoing ability to attract shareholders and investments and indeed customers, and perhaps most importantly, the people craving this improved purpose within companies is new employees. So actually, I think the time is right to ask them to go beyond just the regulation in terms of combating trafficking and organised crime more generally. And let me give you an example of one area where I've seen that working quite well. In the natural resources industry, there is something called the voluntary principles, which are over and above what's required, I think, even by the Modern Slavery Act. And it's a principle that natural resources companies go beyond the Act in how they operate to try and weed out and diligence counterparties and their own supply chains in terms of human trafficking. So there are good examples where industries are going beyond the bare minimum. And I think natural resources is a great, so I've got a great colleague at BP, British Petroleum, who is responsible for their response to voluntary principles. And that's a completely funded post just on that initiative, which is well beyond simple compliance with the Act.
Tuesday, I would just add to what Peter said, or to what Robin has just said. I think that's absolutely right. But I also think that we can get further if we enable consumers and customers. I mean, there's a large movement now in the United States of protecting against illegal fishing, illicit mining, and other products. And the more that the consumers are informed, the more that they're aware, the more that they're looking out for these issues, I think we'll start to bend the curve as well.
Fair point. Thank you. Adam, I don't know if you wanted to speak to this point or else we'll move on.
The one on GSI?
Yep. So a question came in now from Rick Hudson. He asks, is there a role for standards organizations such as GS1 in the supply chain due diligence role?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the projects that I was working on with the World Customs Organization, where we were trying to bring together the 28 or so security solution providers, including GS1, to work in a connected platform. So in other words, customs officials would not need to know all 28, log into 28 different sites to be able to determine whether something is legal or illicit. They would just go to one platform. So, and GS1 was part of that. And I do believe that standard organizations can and should play a role here.
Fantastic. Robin, anything to add here on the role of standards organizations? Because I know you've encountered a few.
I think standards organizations, I think industry organizations, including standards organizations, can really help. It's not always about standards, but let me give you a couple of examples of where it is. The track and trace standards that are available have been introduced by law only very, very rarely. For example, in pharmaceuticals, the Federal Drug Administration is beginning to introduce track and trace standards. There's a European-wide standard for medicines, and there's now a global standard for tobacco on track and trace standards. So progress is being made, but it's been a long time coming. And what's interesting is that there are also vast areas where there are no standards, and that is a good example of that is in transport. They created their own standards around what a good, secure transport, logistics, supply chain should look like. And that was entirely self-generated, nothing to do with the public sector or indeed the justice sector. So some good examples, but vast swathes of area not covered yet, I'd say.
Fair enough. Peter? Peter, anything to add here on supply chain due diligence? Okay, I've just made last calls from the audience if there are any more questions. Otherwise, I might turn us back to our panelists for one and a half minutes worth of a wrap-up and a conclusion. You will remember, of course, that this is an introductory webinar for us to generally look at some of the intersections between human trafficking and other forms of crime. And so perhaps in your conclusion, it would be really nice to hear what you consider to be perhaps the intersection or the illicit intersection most important and relevant that you would think we would need to discuss and address, and where the private sector has most to offer. Any brave volunteers to go first?
It's Peter. I'm going to speak in a Canadian context. Certainly we've seen the intersection with between human trafficking, particularly sex trafficking, and drugs, cocaine, pretty much any type of drug trafficking, and also the intersection of human trafficking with fraud. For instance, when Project Protect first started, we were able to grab certain sectors' interest because when we pointed out that, well, actually, the traffickers often use their victims to bust out credit, etc., like that. That's why you should be interested. So those are two big ones for us in Canada.
Thank you. Adam, you look like you're off mute. You want to go next?
Sure. I'm going to be bold and brave here. I'm going to suggest that if there was one thing that the private sector could drive and lead, would be to create, if you will, a platform of platforms that bring together all of these various initiatives and use, big data approaches to try and help drive policy decisions in the right direction. I mean, it really is great that we've got RESPECT looking at human trafficking, we've got PROTECT doing banking, and there's initiatives on counterfeiting, there's initiatives on fishing, mining, all across the landscape, but it's very difficult to try and pull that together in any kind of intelligent way to create useful information for law enforcement agencies. And I just remember that the massive numbers that Peter or Robin showed in his slide, that the total regular fund budget of Interpol is something like $70 million a year. The total regular fund budget of the World Customs Organization is $20 million a year. So, the challenges are massive. So we're going to have to look at technology and other kinds of approaches to dent this.
Thank you, Adam. That's a very good point, and always a sobering note when you start looking at the money, how massively outspent we often are. Robin, over to you. Biggest intersection challenge, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, I think the challenge is a vast one, and we're talking more broadly here than human trafficking, of course. I guess it's difficult to sort of make any single recommendation, but one thing that in terms of creating change, my belief is that it will only come from being nudged in the right direction, basically. So behaviours are so entrenched in the public and private sectors towards not necessarily being judged on this as a success criterion or a performance criterion. I think it takes one sector or one company even to show how it's done, to show how they can significantly reduce crime and the effect of crime on industries and communities. And it could be one example which is then transported into, or rather sort of communicated much more widely than is currently the case. And you know, I've seen some extraordinary success stories, but they are so isolated that they haven't created success in other sectors. And now we're at a point where technology can be much more intrusive in how we track payments, in how we track products, in how we track people, coming back to human trafficking. Technology and the capabilities of, for example, blockchain could be used to create much more visibility and much more transparency in the way business reports on criminals. And I would love to see some pilot projects around creating that visibility using cheap technology, because it is cheap now, to make a real difference in, say, the pharmaceutical industry in Africa, or the natural resources industries, where we see hundreds of billions worth of oil disappearing from Nigeria. I'd love to see some examples of industry and technology providers getting together and combating that in an efficient way.
I think, as Peter, I think, Robin, there are some examples out there from, with the UN, for instance, experimented with blockchain technology to track aid payments to Africa.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. And again, it's Peter. I'd just like to go back to what Adam was talking about pulling all together, some umbrella body, pulling what I call and still see as these hundreds, if not thousands, of siloed, of well-intentioned effort across the world, just in one country sometimes, these silos of good intent, who are actually in competition with each other. You know, without naming names, I was recently invited on a panel where I call it reinventing the wheel. A lot of well-intentioned banks basically trying to do what had already been done previously, unbeknown to them. And I don't know the solution to how to pull it together, but it certainly needs to be done.
Well, I'm very cheerfully going to close us off there, because you've set me up beautifully to once again plug Respect before we close. I certainly heard from Robin's comments and from your closing comments that the need to identify best practices, to amplify them so that others can replicate, and to provide forums and opportunities for those experiences to be shared, to be built upon, and of course to be coordinated so that we aren't reinventing the wheel and replicating. That is 99% of what we consider Respect's mandate to be, and I have to say that's within the field of human trafficking, but for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, we try to do the same thing for other markets and across other markets. So, you know, a wonderful note, very selfishly, for us to conclude the debate on, and to thank all three of our panelists, Adam, Peter, and Robin, for taking the time to come here and share their work and their experiences. For those of you who have been on our webinars before, and for those of you who haven't, we do make the recordings available usually a month or two afterwards, because we have to go and clean them up and edit them through. And they will now be posted on the Respect website, www.respect.international. And we encourage you all to join us for deeper dives into some of the issues that we've covered today. As I said in the opening, we are looking at five more topics in this series, which will go into different forms of intersections between human trafficking and other illicit industries. We're covering many of the topics that have come up today, the extractive industry, legal fishing, tobacco industry, cyber, and we may well also be looking at pharma. So I thank everybody very much for their active contributions. I hope that it was interesting. I'm sure that it was useful. And I will pass this back to Christina. Christina, our host at Babson. Christina?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tuesday, and to all of our speakers for the extraordinary conversation today. I learned so much. I think we have a lot to think about, and it really set the stage for our next 5 topics, which we really did discuss many of the issues that we're going to be narrowing down in the next few months. So I can't thank all of you enough for sticking with us for the past 2 hours. I want to especially thank John Florendo and Teddy, who's here with me at the Babson studio, for handling all the technical issues and making this webinar run so smoothly. So we look forward to seeing you hopefully next time on Thursday, February 22nd from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Time and 4 to 6 p.m. Central European Time for our next webinar in this series. And I wish you a wonderful rest of the day, evening, afternoon, and morning from wherever you are. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.